Before we continue adulting and get into the rummages of this holiday season, let's cover two more Batman that were recently released as part of this grand wave of checking out more interpretations of the Caped Crusader in McFarlane Toys form. We had two more Batmans that were part of the Black Mask as Batman wave, but since they didn't really fit too well into the whole Halloween spooky season motif, I figured I would give them their own separate video just to see whether or not these are worth picking up out in the wild or as a bundled package, considering that we have some conflicting little details and factors about these figures as to whether or not they should be compacted into your collection. First up is going to be the Batman Inc. or Batman Incorporated DC Multiverse 7-inch Batman figure. Arguably the easiest to kind of breeze through, considering that he is more or less a repaint of a pre-existing figure, something that I was able to deduce from the get-go with those revealed photos, because I recognize that torso, those limbs, those proportions, and even the way that the cape is sort of tooled on top along with that collar piece. Yes, it is nonetheless the Three Jokers buck being repurposed and repainted here to then kind of give off the imagery that he had going on through Batman Incorporated. Which, on the one hand, I can sort of attest, since there's very minute details as to what kind of separates that version of the character from prior versions of Bruce Wayne, heading up his own team of just Bat family overall. But considering that you can look at something like Batman Arkham Knight that gives you access to the suit and kind of gives you a closer in-depth look as to what separates that suit from all the prior ones, it would have to be like that padded look to the overall skin texture for the suit, those lines that kind of cut across from the obliques down to the bottom around the belt area. And so when you then lift that pre-existing buck, you're then gonna feel a little disappointed considering that they just kind of took the buck and gave it this grayish wash, which overall doesn't necessarily look too bad in terms of like this very presenting sort of style. I do understand that they did a good job of kind of masking a little bit of the musculature with this separate sort of gray shading to kind of give it like this watercolor effect. But at the same time, you're going to be missing so many of those little added details that are not only lifted from the Arkham Knight DLC skin, but hell, from just simply looking at some of the panels and some of the imagery that was stenciled into the comic book, you'll realize that there are some different textures at play for that suit. It's frankly the explanation that I can probably serve best as to why it is that I passed this guy up for the longest time. I didn't even pre-order him day one. The only reason why I picked this guy up is because I saw him literally along with the Rainbow Batman, and Target was having a sale where if you buy action figures or some kind of action figure purchase for $50, you get $10 off. So I figured, what the hell? And to hammer home the point of it being a simple repaint, I dug up the Troika Batman, which would arguably be the most recent repurpose or reuse of the Three Jokers buck. Considering that I technically have Three Jokers, and I know that there's a couple of other figures that repurposed and reused that same sculpt over and over, but I feel like this is probably the most recent one, and I feel like this was probably the fairest of them all. I don't know why I just said that. Because of the use of that aforementioned collar piece that I mentioned before, along with the, of course, fabric good cape, except, as you can kind of tell from the sheer ugliness, no wire. Wire is completely missing. I still don't understand why it is that it needed to be omitted this time, considering that we have, again, a repurposed buck. There's nothing really crazy going on with the texture work. There's barely any accessories. If anything, I think this guy had a couple of more accessories since he's got the alternate hands and the batarang, etc. And yet over here, we're only really dealing with two extra pieces to be bundled in there. One would be the grappling hook, and then the other happens to be a gas canister, a sort of flare style canister, so to speak, which has a cool smoky effect here at the tip. Really well painted in terms of the shade of green that they utilized, and both are kind of coated in this sort of I don't want to say bluish, it's almost like a aqua style chrome paint finish, and they're rubberized plastic and sculpted decently, but they do kind of have a tendency to bend, specifically the hooks along this grapple here, but no sort of wiring to sort of make it seem like he can rope from it, no sort of grapple gun that it dispels from, nothing. It's just these two pieces right here that can fit into either of his gripping hands, which don't necessarily get swapped out for anything else. So I'm thinking to myself exactly what it is, the rationale as to why there's no wiring. I understand that I can do it myself. It's a do-it-DIY project. I'm sorry, but again, the fact that you've done it before still does not lend into any form of explanation why you can't do it again, especially when, again, the sculpting is being repurposed here. And if anything, it has a little bit of a hindrance on the articulation, because unlike this guy who's simply just a plastic, a black plastic that was able to at least skirt by some joints of the articulation, due to that extra layer of paint to give it this blue grayish tint to it, that it definitely has a form of shell presence. It unfortunately does hinder the articulation, which I'm not really going to cover in broad strokes here, because it's essentially the exact same joints as the Three Jokers body, the JLA body that was part of that Build-A-Figure for the Plastic Man, and then once again here for Troika Batman. So not much there that I can really regurgitate, aside from the fact that it's difficult to move, even passing it with the blow dryer, which I've already done a couple of times. And sure, it's had an effective job of loosening up some of the joints, and at least the points at present here are pretty favorable for certain poses. But when you're dealing with just a couple of little accessories here that don't necessarily add too much value to the figure, on top of the already repurposed bug, it's like you really have to start asking yourself, at what point am I going to start to sort of just feel apathy for certain releases of these figures, just to kind of, like I said, checkbox this particular look? Which, I guess if I am to at least appeal across the board, we have to at least point out some of the more favorable differences to set this guy apart, which, from what you can tell, the gauntlets and the boots have a deceptive look to them, because at first glance they simply just appear black and very generic. But once you get a little closer, you'll notice that you have a couple of little distinguishing details, a few factors to them that at least separates it from the pack. The gauntlets at first seem to be the most minimally changed, but you'll notice that you have a little bit of this like added little detail around the wrist area that has a bit of a grid textured feel to it. And then the boots, even though the actual like piece, the tallest part of the boots that kind of circumference the calf and the shin look about identical as to those of the previous two figures that this is lifted from, you'll notice that you have some additional pieces of rubberized plastic adhered to the boots that have more of a working shoe style to them, as opposed to the much more loafer style that we had going on with Troika over here. And then of course some of the much more in-your-face sort of differences from the very unique utility belt that I argue is probably the best detail, my favorite detail out of this whole entire ensemble here, which would have to be the very unique utility belt, even though it could make for some added paint deco. But at least you're dealing with some cool sculpt work for the buckle, the pockets on the sides. Even the bat symbol is, quite frankly, in fact, I thought to myself, oh, they certainly changed the bat symbol. No, it's literally identical to that of the Troika Batman, and for that matter, probably the Three Jokers Batman. But at least here, they added that little yellow faded glow effect to the circumference of the symbol on the chest plate there. And then, of course, you got the head sculpt, which I'd argue is pretty definitive for a Batman figure. You got, of course, the classic look to the cowl with these slightly shorter ears, but they kind of embed themselves into the brow of the cowl that, to me, is pretty satisfying to see. Got the whited eyes, but then you also got some really good effects for the paint applications of the 5 o'clock shadow. If anything, whatever they did here, please keep going with it, McFarlane, because I've had my criticisms with your guys' approach to beards and 5 o'clock shadows before and stubble. I think you kind of nailed it here. Whatever science you managed to accumulate for this specific approach to stubble, keep doing it, because this is probably one of the best interpretations of that in a really long time. Yeah, outside of that though, that's really about the extent, because at this point I run the risk of rambling. And this essentially leads to Batman Inc. probably harboring a 6 out of 10. A very okay rating for a figure that is nonetheless just there to fulfill a spot for people that were probably requesting a Batman Inc. skin over some of the more reutilized bucks in McFarlane DC Multiverse history. But outside of that, either pick them up only because you truly feel like you need to have them in your collection, or if you manage to scrounge up a deal or some kind of coupon sort of favor from your favorite retail store like I did with Target. But at least I'll have plenty of more to say about Earth 2 Society Batman, aka Mustache Batman, only because of whatever it is the hell that he's got going on right here. And frankly, that's probably the extent of what I know about this multiversal, elseworld sort of incarnation of the Caped Crusader, the Dark Knight, considering that this is the same sort of plane, some sort of tangent from the comic books that have to deal with that alternate version of Superman, etc. Not really well versed in that. I just know that in regards to a McFarlane Toys DC Multiverse version of this Batman, it was probably the one that was surprisingly impressing me the most, considering its colorway. It's predominantly black, as Batman often tends to be, but there was something about this copperish sort of orange accent application to it that really spoke to me in a way that it's like, okay, there's something going on with this book that at least is not only harnessing the strength of this colorway, but it's also making me look at some of the tooling of this body and making me think that, okay, maybe there's not a whole lot of reuse here. And if there is, it's at least disguising it in a way that is sort of bypassing me, because frankly, at the time of this recording, I can't really deduce exactly where specific parts of this body are hailed from. So if any of you guys know specifically which body this is being lifted from, if it's a reuse, if it's like a Frankenstein sort of situation, please let me know, because right now, I feel like the illusion is sort of working on me, and if anything, that's something that I've often strived for toy companies like McFarlane, like Mattel, like Hasbro, should at least try to strive for, to at least make the value proposition, especially when you're uptaking the price, a bit more worth it. And whether there's a reuse happening here or not, at least a good chunk of this body is doing it for me, as far as like the paneling, giving it this very armorized look with a little bit of fringes, touches, so to speak, of alien sort of details, sort of aesthetics, in regards to how these panels right here are not necessarily very jagged. They kind of have a little bit of curvature, specifically with some of the ones that are going on right here for the shoulders, a little bit around the bicep area, and then kind of keeping that orange aesthetic in line with a little bit of pipe deco happening right there. The only areas in regards to that orange sort of copper aesthetic or colorway that doesn't necessarily work for me all that greatly would have to be these little like circles, these little like points to kind of apply it right here. They just feel very slapdash, like they were just kind of stamped on there. So I understand that it's supposed to be there to replicate his look from that Earth 2 Society comic, but at the same time, they just feel like they're kind of running amok right here around the forearm, both of the hands. If anything, they are able to at least sort of hide in plain sight and give a little bit of purpose, so to speak, to the joints right here for the knees. You'll notice right here that they managed to color in the pins for the knee joints accordingly so that they kind of mask themselves into the suit themselves, which is pretty creative. I just wish that creativity would have bled on through to the elbow joints, because you'll notice that the pins for the elbows are completely black and still present there. So if anything, you might as well at least gone all the way and incorporated some of that orange paint application to these joints on over here. That aside, the figure itself definitely does feel solid and firm and really well tooled, specifically with, like I mentioned before, the continuance of the lining for the armor, specifically around the thighs, the armor plating around the shins. It feels pretty solid. It feels like I said, a pretty hefty figure that resembles that of Batman. If anything, I would just argue that maybe some of the most panelized just again kind of gives a little bit of credence to what people have often complained about McFarlane, which is that you have all of these little like plates that could have probably added a level of life, a level of quality to the figure should they have been painted in. It kind of feels like we're being dealt a coloring book that is just empty, but of course the purpose of a coloring book is to paint them in. Still, I really enjoy how different everything feels in regards to like the bat symbol kind of encroaching the entirety of the chest and the pecs, so to speak, right here, cutting across and kind of bleeding down towards the diaper piece, which then in turn doesn't necessarily have a utility belt, but has these like cartridges or compartments sort of kind of bleeding on down and kind of over encumbering the top sides of the legs right here, but still being rubberized enough to kind of bend and give way a little bit for some added flexibility that we'll cover during the articulation portion. But overall, it just feels pretty solid and does really impress me, especially since they managed to reoccur that compliment that I was giving the Batman Incorporated Batman in regards to the 5 o'clock shadow and still keep it cohesive here for Earth 2 Society Batman, with a little bit of stubble happening on the mouth plate, despite said mouth plate being mostly covered up by that mustache piece. I understand that it's technically not a mustache, it's part of his face, it's part of the mask, but at the same time, I don't understand why it's so busy. And granted, they did a pretty decent job of trying to replicate the busyness of the cowl here in plastic form, and overall, it almost makes way for probably a very definitive look to the cowl. If anything, I would argue, I will kind of throw this out into the ether, that if they ever come up with yet another Batman, or hell, if they ever manage to finally fulfill one of the biggest in-demand McFarlane Toys Batman figures that people have been asking for, myself included, which is an Arkham Origins Batman, this is arguably the cowl, the head sculpt, that I would suggest to use. All you have to really do, of course, is paint in the eyes, change the aesthetic of the gray, the black, from to much more of like a jet black gray to match the aesthetics of that suit, and then of course fill in the mouth plate accordingly, get rid of the mustache part, and simply fill in the lips, and you got yourself a younger Bruce Wayne from Arkham Origins. If anything, maybe the ears would require a little bit of tweaking, but the way that these ears sort of connect themselves to the brow once more, if anything, it's very pleasing for me that I wouldn't necessarily be remissing of not seeing this head sculpt again, or this Buck for that matter. Just like I said, overhaul some of the alien-like aesthetics, or multiversal, transversal aesthetics in regards to how big the traps are, or the way that everything is kind of connected here on the top side here, which then leads us to yet another major mishap here, which would have to be the nylon cloth cape. Two things. One, once again, we're missing the wire. I don't exactly know why it's not there, especially when you take into consideration the fact that it's stitched fairly well right here with a hollowed out piece. So it's almost like at this point they expect us to do it. I'm sorry, but you guys have the money. It's just a wire. You've done it before. And I guess that's kind of what gets me under my skin, is the fact that they've done it before. But now they're it's almost like they got a little ahead of themselves, and now they're looking at their quote-unquote wire budget and thinking to themselves, oh no, we can't do the wire anymore. Shit, what do we do now? Okay, I guess we now have to get very specific and pick and choosy as to which caped action figures, caped characters, specifically Batman, are entitled to the wire. And sure, they're not necessarily lying anymore. It's not like they're saying from the get-go that it's got a wire when in reality it doesn't. They are technically transparent and saying in the description that it just comes with a fabric cape. They never specifically use the word wire, but it still doesn't necessarily stop them from including one. But anyways, I'll get off of that soapbox and just bring about one other little nitpick, which would have to be that they managed to stitch the cape fairly well on the sides here, but there is a little bit of this weird sort of pinching thing that's happening here in the middle part, to the point where it's sort of leading to this kind of hole kind of peering on right through. So I kind of wish that they would have maybe at least pulled the cape a little bit more towards the front to at least cover up a little bit of this dangling bit in the middle side here. And the wiring inside of the cape would have gone a long way of complementing the articulation, which I think is pretty damn good on this Buck, whichever it is that it's lifted from. The head is definitely able to rotate the full 360, absolutely no problem. Feels pretty smooth and firm in the joint in and of itself, and it's able to tilt pretty nicely up and down, as you can kind of see right there. Side to side could be a little bit more desirable, but it's still not too bad on its own. The top arms can definitely rotate the full 360 in place, no problem, and can kind of extend over to the sides and even kind of peer a little bit past the 180-degree angle, as you can kind of make out right there. And I think it's due in part to a little bit, just a tiny little bit of butterfly mobility via the dumbbell joint inside that can kind of flex a little bit towards the front like so, a little bit towards the back because of a little bit of slack that it gives you via the tooling that could be found right about right there. Biceps can fully rotate the full 360, absolutely no problem. Two elbow joints that can fully bend all the way up per usual. Now, you do have ball joints for the wrists. However, there's enough, like I mentioned before, flex and spacing to allow the full hand to rotate the full 360 degrees, no problem, and bend inwards and outwards. Pretty complimentary. And frankly, I don't think I'm out of pocket when I say, as the kids like to say, when I say that the torso articulation is probably one of the better ones that I've seen, at least, let's at least say this year, because the torso is able to nudge pretty flexibly, almost a 90-degree angle from side to side. Unfortunately, it's not in the ways of the full 360 because of how wide they made the chest piece and how it's able to kind of snug up on the actual abdominal piece. But when it comes to extension from the back to the front, it's actually pretty flexible, as you can kind of make out right about right there. Then we get further mobility via the waist that can then fully rotate the full 360, absolutely no problem. But because of how rubberized they made the diaper piece, but at the same time, it's not overly baggy, it's able to at least tighten up around the top part of the legs right here, the hips, as well as the abdominal joint, that not only does it, and it's also leading to the fact that this is such a busy suit that it's at least able to kind of hide in plain sight in terms of the bagginess. And that bagginess also allows further flexibility of the waist towards the back and towards the front and even side to side. So you can kind of make out right there that you got really great mobility in regards to the torso. Very, almost a stark contrast to the flexibility of the Three Jokers body that we covered with Batman Inc. So when it comes to the top legs, you're naturally going to be able to flex them pretty high up, as you can kind of make out right there, and they feel pretty good in hand. Don't feel all too rough. It doesn't feel like we're necessarily going to be breaking any of the plastic. And I think that's also due in part to the fact that most of this plastic is just naturally black. I think the only painted on parts would have to be the orange colorway, the orange accents. And therefore, you're led to an awful lot of mobility with the top legs, as you've seen right there, forwards and backs, and then most definitely side to side, almost at the full 180. And that's even considering the little cartridges that he's got on the utility belt, or at least on the hip side right here. But they eventually do get kind of in the way right there, just barely shy of the 180-degree angle. And then, of course, you got the two knee joints that can fully bend all the way up, no problems right there. Similar to the wrist, you do have ball joints that can definitely still allow the foot to rotate the full 360 because of how much real estate, you don't have anything kind of snugging or tightening around the joints. And therefore, even though this does lend to a little bit of exposure of the joints that look a little awkward or a little antiquated to find them here in 2025 versus how they appeared to be back in the DC Multiverse days of 2021, at least you're dealing with good flexibility for the articulation. Like I mentioned before, the foot can fully rotate 360, bend downwards and upwards a pretty good amount, and even incline and pivot slightly inwards and outwards. And then naturally, you're going to have the toes that can fully bend almost practically not only past the 90-degree angle, but even more so than that. You can see right there that it's looking rather uncomfortable, but generally you can find the articulation there. So you can note right there that even though you're going to have some pretty nostalgic ties to this buck right here that hail from that of late 2020, early 2021, McFarlane Toys DC Multiverse, it's at least with a body that at least feels unique, even if it may not end up being truly unique. And frankly, the only thing that it's kind of hindering a little bit on this pickup would have to be, like I mentioned before, the lack of the wire for the cape, or maybe any genuine true accessories to be bundled in with such a unique take on Batman. Because he only really comes with one alternate set of hands, one of which is simply just a fist to replace the open, sort of semi-clenched right hand. And then the gripping hand that he's got going on over here on the left probably could have been utilized for some kind of grapple or gadget, whatever the case may be, lifted from that comic. And instead, they decided to take what you would have typically expected for a McFarlane Toys Batman to come with, and did the thing that from time to time, I kind of like it, but here I feel like it's a bit of a missed opportunity, which is to have what is called, what I like to call at least, a Batarang hand. And by that, I mean a Bataranged hand. Not so much a hand that is sculpted and designed to hold a Batarang, but rather one that has the Batarangs sculpted into it. You naturally have three Batarangs sort of embedded into the hand itself, Wolverine style, and simply that is your way of kind of making it seem like he's about to throw the Batarangs. But unfortunately, this leads to non-functioning Batarangs, something that I think could have been better realized in a figure such as this. And when you do swap him out, there's no denying that he looks pretty badass. It would just look even better if, I don't know, that cape was maybe blowing in the distance and I can style it and keep it that way. But unfortunately, that's not going to be the case. Unless, of course, I plan out a weekend to then not just retool and, like I said, DIY project the hell out of this thing to incorporate a wire. But if I do it for this guy, I naturally need to just sit down, knuckle it out, and do it for a handful of other figures, the Batman Inc. figure from this review included. And at this point, it's really bewildering. Like I said, the only explanation that I can really pull out of my ass at this point is that there must have been some kind of designated wire budget, and that's frankly what's impeding the inclusion of these wires for all caped figures, whether it be Batman, Superman, any other incarnation of a character that boasts a cape. And at this point, it's probably being reserved for either deluxe theatrical editions or collector's editions, which would require, of course, that heftier price tag. At least within the confines of a solo DC Multiverse release at $26.99 roughly, give or take, this is not a bad-looking Batman. But again, the missed opportunity of the accessories along with that wired cape keeps this guy at a very even 7 out of 10. And that vocation alone probably makes him a bit more worthwhile to pick up on the shelf, regardless of whether you have a coupon or an offer or a sale, at least more so than Batman Inc. here, which again is simply just a repaint that thus calls upon the necessity to pick them up to either complete your entirety of the McFarlane Toys DC set, or you have simply just that huge of a fondness for the Batman Incorporated storyline from the comics. And there you have it, 2 more Batman pumped out by McFarlane and reviewed by me. What else has really changed up until this point? And arguably, I guess you could say that this can serve as a form of a journalistic documentation of where we're at with McFarlane Toys DC Multiverse and their output of Batmans that now at this point, with, like I said, the shaky ground of the license and how action figure collecting as a whole from different companies is sort of in a very tumultuous place with tariffs and how costly things are getting, but at the same time the shrinkflation that is going around with different industries and hobbyists in the like, it's definitely kind of putting things into perspective, especially after coming off the heels of that very difficult Batman Returns wave review that I did. And it's probably cementing the notion that maybe 2025, or at least the end of 2025, is going to be the curtain call for me and McFarlane Toys DC Multiverse. For now, what do you guys think of Batman Incorporated or Earth 2 Society Batman from McFarlane Toys DC Multiverse? Is it a pickup? Is it a pass? Is it something that you're waiting for some kind of sale or clearance whenever that happens? And of course, if you guys enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. If not, give it a thumbs down. And as always, stay humble, and I'll catch you later.